when spring searchers found Everett Cross's trapping cabin in April of 1907. They discovered him frozen in his bunk, wrapped in every piece of clothing and blanket he owned, positioned as if he had simply gone to sleep one night during the winter and had never woken up. But the calendar he had been keeping on the cabin wall showed that he had survived until late February, more than 4 months after the first snow that should have signaled his departure, that he had marked off each day of his extended stay with methodical precision, and that his final entry had been made on February 28th, with handwriting that had deteriorated from the neat script of November into barely legible marks that suggested hands too cold or too weakened to form letters properly. The cabin still contained adequate supplies, still held firewood that could have lasted weeks more, and still showed evidence of a man who had maintained survival routines through months of isolation. But it also showed evidence that he had stayed when he should have left, that each day's delay had made the next day's departure less possible, and that somewhere between the first snow in October and the final impossible conditions of February, he had crossed the invisible line where leaving transformed from difficult to impossible, and where staying became a slow death sentence that careful rationing and maintained routines could only postpone, but never prevent. Welcome to this journey through one of the most precisely documented decisions to delay departure ever recorded in the Ozark wilderness. In the years when trappers worked autumn and early winter seasons in isolated territories, and when the arrival of first snow was understood to be the signal that departure should be immediate, because snow that started in October would become impassable by November and impossible by December. When experienced trappers knew that one more week of trapping was not worth the risk of being trapped for an entire winter in locations that were meant for temporary occupation rather than sustained survival, there lived a man who decided that he could stay just a little longer after the first snow, who convinced himself that conditions would allow departure in a few more days or a few more weeks, and who demonstrated through his frozen death and through his calendar that marked 142 days of waiting, that the decision to stay one more day becomes the decision to stay forever, when each day of staying makes conditions worse and makes departure more dangerous until the window closes completely, and the only choice remaining is to wait for spring that may come too late to matter. Leave a comment where you're watching from, as we trace the line between calculated risk and fatal delay, between one more day and one day too many. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we enter that isolated cabin and watch days accumulate into months, while snow accumulates into barriers, consider what first snow meant to trappers and why experienced wilderness workers understood that delaying departure after first snow was gambling with conditions that would not improve and that would only become more dangerous the longer departure was postponed. Trappers worked autumn seasons because fur quality was best during cold months and because the work could be completed before deep winter made travel impossible. The pattern was simple and proven. Enter trapping territory in September or early October, work through autumn while conditions remained manageable, and leave immediately when first significant snow fell, because that snow indicated that winter had arrived and that conditions would deteriorate rapidly from that point forward. The temptation to stay longer was always present. A few more days of trapping meant more furs and more profit, meant justifying the effort of reaching remote territory, meant maximizing the season's work before abandoning trap lines that had been set and baited and positioned through weeks of labor. But experienced trappers knew that maximizing profit meant nothing if departure became impossible, that furs collected were worthless if they could not be transported out, and that staying too long transformed a successful season into a winter of confinement that might end in death if supplies ran out. or if isolation and cold created conditions that a temporary camp was never designed to endure. First snow was not arbitrary. It was signal based on accumulated experience that said conditions were changing, that travel was still possible now, but would not be possible soon, and that departure needed to occur immediately, while routes remained passable, rather than waiting to see if conditions would stabilize or improve. Conditions never improved after first snow. They always worsened. Snow that fell in October was followed by more snow in November, and deeper snow in December, and impossible snow in January and February. The trapper who left after first snow might face difficult travel, but would face possible travel. The trapper who waited faced increasing impossibility, until eventually impossibility became absolute, and staying became the only option, not because staying was wise, but because leaving had become unsurvivable. Everett Cross was 34 years old in the autumn of 1906, an experienced trapper who had worked wilderness territories for 12 years, who knew the patterns of weather and the risks of delayed departure, and who was known among other trappers as a careful man who made conservative decisions and who prioritized safety over profit. He had trapped successfully for many seasons, had always departed before conditions became dangerous, and had built a reputation as someone who understood wilderness risks and who managed them appropriately. In September 1906, Cross entered a remote section of the Ozark wilderness, approximately 40 miles from the nearest permanent settlement, establishing a trapping cabin that would serve as his base for the autumn season. The cabin was simple: single room, basic stove, adequate for temporary occupation, but not designed for extended winter habitation. Cross carried supplies sufficient for approximately 3 months: food, ammunition, basic necessities, anticipating that he would work through September and October and would depart by early November at the latest, well before deep winter made travel dangerous. The autumn of 1906 was productive. Cross's trap lines were successful, fur quality was good, and by mid-October he had accumulated a substantial collection that represented significant profit if he could transport it to settlement. But mid-October also brought the first snow, a substantial storm that dropped 8 inches over 2 days, arriving earlier than Cross had anticipated, and creating the signal that experienced trappers knew meant immediate departure was necessary. Cross faced the decision that many trappers faced when first snow came earlier than expected: leave immediately or with a good but not exceptional collection of furs, or stay longer to maximize the season's work before departing. The conservative choice was to leave immediately. The risky choice was to stay, gambling that conditions would remain manageable for a few more weeks and that departure could be accomplished before snow became impassable. Cross, despite his reputation for conservative decisions, chose to stay. His reasoning was documented in a journal he kept throughout the autumn and winter, a record that would be found with his body and that provided insight into how the decision to delay evolved from calculated risk to fatal miscalculation. His October entries indicated that he believed the early snow was anomalous, that weather would moderate as it often did in mid-autumn, and that a few more weeks of trapping would be possible before departure became necessary. He wrote that the snow was manageable, that his trap lines were still accessible, and that leaving immediately would mean abandoning work that could still be profitably completed if he remained just a little longer. The few more weeks became several more weeks. Through late October and into November, Cross continued trapping, continued accumulating furs, and continued waiting for conditions that would make departure seem optimal rather than merely possible. His journal entries during this period showed the pattern of rationalization that many trappers who stayed too long displayed, Each day seemed manageable. Each additional day of trapping seemed worth the slight additional risk, and departure could always be postponed until tomorrow or next week, when conditions might be better, or when just a few more trap lines could be checked. By mid-November, conditions had deteriorated significantly. Additional snow had fallen, accumulation was substantial, and temperatures had dropped to levels that made travel dangerous. Cross's journal entries became less confident, began to acknowledge that he had perhaps waited too long, but also continued to suggest that departure was still possible, and that waiting for the right moment to leave was wiser than attempting to leave in current conditions that were difficult, though not yet impossible. The critical error was visible in hindsight, but not apparent to someone making daily decisions based on day-to-day conditions. Cross was waiting for conditions to improve when conditions were never going to improve, was delaying departure in hope of better weather when better weather was not coming, and was allowing each day of delay to make the next day's departure more difficult, until difficulty transformed into impossibility, and choice transformed into confinement. By early December, Cross's journal tone had changed from optimism to concern. He acknowledged explicitly that he had stayed too long, that departure should have occurred in October or early November, and that he was now in a situation where leaving was extremely dangerous, but where staying meant enduring winter in a cabin that was not designed for sustained occupation. He wrote about attempting to leave, packing his essential supplies, preparing for the journey, but also wrote about recognizing that attempting to travel 40 miles through deep snow in bitter cold with heavy pack was likely suicidal, that he would almost certainly become exhausted or lost or frozen before reaching settlement, and that staying in the cabin, where he at least had shelter and supplies, offered better survival odds than attempting travel that would probably end in death. So Cross stayed, not because staying was safe, but because leaving had become more dangerous than staying, because the window for departure had closed while he had been waiting for it to open wider, and because the decision to stay one more day in October had accumulated into the necessity of staying all winter by December. His journal through December and January documented the slow deterioration that extended winter isolation created. Cross maintained routines, keeping fire, preparing food, checking supplies, marking days on the calendar. But the routines were maintenance of existence rather than preparation for activity, were ways to pass time rather than productive work, and were performed in a cabin that was increasingly cold despite fire, increasingly dark despite lamps, and increasingly confining despite his ability to move around the single room. He wrote about the psychological effects of isolation, the silence that became oppressive, the sameness of days that made time feel simultaneously endless and meaningless, the knowledge that no help would come until spring and that spring was months away. He wrote about rationing his supplies carefully, calculating that if he consumed food at minimal rates, he could survive until March or April, when conditions would moderate and departure would become possible again. He wrote about the cold that penetrated despite the stove's heat, about nights when temperatures dropped so low that he wore every piece of clothing he owned and still felt cold, about mornings when ice had formed inside the cabin despite fire having burned through the night. By late January, his entries had become shorter and less frequent. He wrote about feeling weak, about difficulty maintaining routines that had been easy in November, about the effort required to perform simple tasks like gathering firewood from the diminishing stack outside the cabin. He wrote about hoping that February would bring warming that would allow departure, about needing to survive just a few more weeks until conditions moderated enough that travel would be survivable. His final entries in late February were barely legible. The handwriting had deteriorated, suggesting hands that struggled to hold a pen, suggesting cold or exhaustion or the kind of physical deterioration that extended, deprivation created. His last entry on February 28th consisted of a date and a few words that searchers who found the journal could not fully decipher, but that seemed to suggest he understood that survival had become uncertain, that spring might come too late, and that the decision to stay in October had led to this February moment when staying had consumed everything that made survival possible. When spring searchers found Cross in April, it was clear that he had died sometime in late February or early March, probably from a combination of hypothermia, malnutrition, and the accumulated effects of 5 months of isolation and deprivation in a cabin never meant for sustained winter occupation. His body was in his bunk, wrapped in every available covering, positioned as if he had simply gone to sleep and never woken. The calendar on the wall showed 142 days marked off from the first snow in mid-October to his final entry on February 28th. The cabin still contained some food, still had some firewood, suggesting that complete depletion had not occurred, but that Cross had weakened to the point where he could no longer maintain the routines that survival required, where getting out of bed to tend fire or prepare food had become more effort than his remaining strength allowed, and where the final days or weeks had been spent lying in his bunk, waiting for either spring or death, whichever came first. The furs he had stayed to collect, the reason for his delayed departure, the profit that had seemed worth the additional risk in October, were found hanging in the cabin, perfectly preserved by the cold, worthless, because he had not survived to transport them to market. The success he had gambled to achieve was complete in every way, except the only way that mattered. He had the furs but would never profit from them, had maximized his season's work, but had lost his life in the process, had won the calculation about trapping, but had lost the calculation about surviving. The community of trappers who learned of Cross's death understood immediately what had happened, recognized the pattern of delayed departure that they had seen in other cases where trappers stayed too long, and added Cross's story to the collective warnings that experienced wilderness workers shared about the dangers of staying past first snow. The lesson was simple and had been learned many times before. First snow means leave immediately. One more day of trapping is not worth the risk of being trapped for winter. And the decision to stay when you should leave transforms from calculated risk to fatal error in ways that are invisible in the moment, but that become obvious in hindsight when calendars show 142 days of waiting and bodies show what happens when waiting extends past the limits of what supplies and shelter and human endurance can sustain. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the most precisely documented decisions to delay departure. A trapper who stayed after first snow believing he could leave in a few more days, who marked each day of his extended stay with methodical precision, and who demonstrated through his calendar and his journal and his frozen death that staying one more day becomes staying forever when each day makes departure less possible and when the window for leaving closes, while you are still deciding whether to leave now or tomorrow. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory, where one more day becomes one day too many, consider subscribing to Commutales for more stories that explore the boundaries between calculated risk and fatal delay. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on when Cross should have recognized his window had closed. And if this story resonated with you, a like helps bring these narratives to more people. Until our next journey, remember that somewhere in the Ozark wilderness there is a cabin where a trapper once marked 142 days on a calendar after first snow, and where his final mark in late February was followed by silence,